Hello, Internet, and welcome to another episode of Experimental Cataclysm, the show where we talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm: Dark Days Ahead. Now, this week I've got a ton of changes, however, many of them are pretty small things. Now, I've had a few complaints that I only ever cover 5 or 6 changes in some episodes, which is absolutely true. It's just that we get quite, a few hundred changes a week. It's pretty hard to keep up with them all, and most of them are really small things that don't have a major impact to discuss at length in the video. However, this week I've included a bunch of things that are pretty self-explanatory for us to just touch on briefly. So first up today from Karam Baba G, we've got the addition of a Ballista. Now these would be the giant crossbow-like weapons mounted on a cart or whatever. I don't know, you play video games, you've seen them before. Now this one is not actually a siege weapon, instead it's designed to be mounted on a vehicle and used to target a single enemy. Now there was a fair bit of discussion about this in the PR, you can check it out, I'm no expert, but I did notice it deals enough damage to one-shot a lot of enemies. Now I mostly think it's a pretty silly thing that I'm never going to use personally, but I'm sure a lot of people will like that this exists. Next up today from Kaz Wetson, we've got a fix for zombie soldiers. Some of these enemies previously would drop a rifle with an attached grenade launcher, but they would never actually spawn with the associated grenades. Now, like most of our ammunition and firearms, it would make sense if the dead guy had spent some of that defending himself, but to never drop it at all does seem wrong. So this was fixed. They should now sometimes drop ammo for their associated underbarrel grenade launchers. Next up today from Duke Paul Atreides, we've got a rename for the Psychopath trait. Now it was renamed to Uncaring, which I don't love that name, but I also don't love that it was Psychopath either. And the discussion surrounding this, again, you can read it if you want, link in the description down below. People get really bent out of shape over these renames to traits. I remember when schizophrenia was changed to calyptic psychosis and people would not shut up about it. So I'm sure that some of you watching this will be angry about it, but yeah, it changed. The end. Next up today from Sluggy Slug, we've got an early game craftable quiver in the form of a pipe quiver. There's also a larger version. These are made from pipes and are both auto-learned at archery skill level of 1 or at Fab 1 and Fab 2 respectively. I don't have much to say here, hooray for pipe quivers, although the image provided is of a PVC pipe and our pipes are steel. I don't know if that actually matters. And moving on, next up today from Physics Enthusiast, we've got a PR that I have no idea what it means, but I figured some of you would want to know about it. It says, quote, enable Bionic power conversion UPSs to draw from Bionic power. I have no idea how these UPSs, or really any UPS, works in the game. I haven't used them in many years, but it sounded important, so I thought I would mention it. Next up today from Nebnis, we've got an adjustment to the Portal Storm Pain event. Now, I'm still not a fan of Portal Storms in general. I am tempted to just disable them if I could in all of my playthroughs, which is why I rarely discuss their updates and changes. I still think they're in a weird spot and I'm not fully on board with them personally. Regardless, there is an event that occurs that causes you a great deal of pain, which is pretty severe. Now this has now been reduced, giving only a third of the pain that it did previously. Unavoidable random pain, Portal Storm or not, it doesn't seem like a great mechanic to me, and nerfing it to a lower value makes a lot of sense in my opinion. It's like a slowly growing pain rather than something that's almost instantly debilitating. Next up today from Carol, we've got a fish size audit. Basically, this ran through a bunch of the fish in the game, making sure that their weights and their volumes are appropriate. Now, I'm not up to date on average fish sizes in the game or in real life, but I'll just assume it's an improvement here. Now, I only really mention this because I believe butchery is a percentage based on the weight or volume or whatever of the creature that you're butchering, so this may improve or harm meat yields from those fish moving forward. Next up today from ZenFS, we've got the ZenFS sidebar. Imagine that. Now this is a new sidebar and I'm mentioning it because I haven't seen a new sidebar in a while. Well, I haven't noticed one. There may have been new ones that I missed. It is available in the sidebar panel for you to check out, and it was even updated in a separate PR with some improvements. Next up today from Patrick Lundell, we've got a new display toggle for the Zone Manager tool. Now essentially this adds a key that allows you to display a zone's location. Previously you could only see the location if you opened the Manager tool and hovered over that particular zone. Now with this you can actually mark a zone to be displayed at all times even when the Manager tool is closed. This is a simple letter display in ASCII on the main game screen, and when you actually look at that tile it will list which zones occupy that space. Now in terms of feedback, I do find it a little annoying that these disappear when they're out of sight, so if you step too far from your piles you can't see which is which, and this ultimately is a very minor complaint, and I'm not even sure it would actually be better if they were displayed at all times. This probably is the best way to do it already. And then my second piece of feedback is that I think there should be a button to toggle all zones to be displayed. Currently you have to enable the display individually for each zone. It would be nice to just be able to hit one key and have all of them marked. Now beyond that, I do actually really like this change. Having a visual marker for where my zones are is a nice little bit of quality of life improvement. Next up today from E. Hughes Baird, we've got a toggle for drug brand names. Now a while back, drugs were sort of generalized, removing their brand names and giving them catch-all names based on their category. For example, in the game previously, you could find Thorazine, however that was changed to no longer be Thorazine, but to be titled as antipsychotic. Now this toggle was added to the interface tab in your settings menu, line 19, called Show Drug Brand Names. Now this follows the same style of what we have for the gun brand names in the game, and I think our community is a lot more interested in guns than medication, and quite a few of our drugs are still just catch-all titles anyway, and they're not specific brand names. For example, I don't think we have any brands of antibiotics or antifungals, they are just called antibiotics and antifungals. And I don't think a lot of our players are going to have strong feelings about this, whether it's enabled or disabled by default. I don't know that most people are going to care. However, I do usually like these things in general, giving people the freedom to play the game how they want. Some people don't want to see antidepressant names, they just want generic information. And I know when we got gun brand names, I pushed back on that and was like, oh, I think by default people would like them to be enabled. But I was wrong. People really came out of the woodwork to say like, no, I really prefer not having gun brand names. So maybe there are people who are going to care about this a lot, and I just don't know, so I'm not going to remark on it too much. So there you go. You can now toggle drug brand names, which will affect those that actually have their own properly named variants, but it's not going to affect things like antibiotics currently. Next up today from NetSysFire, we've got some changes to sewer creatures, and we've got changes to how some characters will feel about being in a sewer. So first up, the spawns here were changed. According to the bullet points, sewer-ranas, gators, sewer snakes, and frog mothers will no longer spawn in sewers. However, frogs and tadpoles and cats can spawn there rarely. Now these spawns have been replaced with the more common flies, rats, and raccoons, as well as sewer slimes, which are new creatures added in this PR. Now these are basically regular slimes, except they also do biological damage, which I don't know how to feel about that because I don't know how you protect yourself from biological damage, but it does look like it's only one biological damage added to their melee attack. Now they also explode into toxic gas on death, which is annoying but fine. There is a typo in the description as well with an extra "the" in there, so if you want like an easy PR, someone can go and knock that out. There's another new creature as well called the Dexterous Raccoon, which apparently can open doors and eat your food, but are described as, quote, not overly hostile. In the PR, they say this is in preparation for something they want to do with reworking subways, but they didn't actually elaborate on that, so I'm not really sure what that means. And since I mentioned the typo, I was really paying attention to the descriptions of these creatures. In this one line, it does say, quote, you wonder if these sleazy beasts are able to open doors yet. And while I appreciate that you were trying to explain their door opening ability, it's a really clunky way of doing that. Just, I don't know if this is like mean feedback or not. I also personally dislike descriptions that tell me what my character is thinking or feeling. So seeing, quote, you wonder is something where you're telling me what I am feeling and thinking in that moment, and I really just disapprove of that personally. I don't know how other people feel about that. I don't like that. But anyway, there was also mention in the PR of characters with the squeamish trait getting special debuffs for being in the sewer. Now, these come in the form of morale debuffs, which are labeled as, quote, hates being in the sewer with a minus 22 morale. There's also a periodic sewer message that was added, which should appear for all characters, saying things like, quote, you think you just saw a small worm-like creature vanish into the filthy water. And these are just ambient messages, but I really do like that. Like, at least that one is really good. And I know people worry about message spam, but when I was waiting around in the sewer, I was getting like 2 per hour of these messages, so I don't think they'll be too spammy. But anyway, overall, I don't have any major issues with the PR. I really don't go in the sewers ever because there's just not a reason to, so I'm not even really familiar with how they were previously. The raccoon, I don't fully understand why they exist. It's literally just a raccoon that's described as having like big hands and can open doors for some reason. And then the slimes with their gas explosion they're just immensely obnoxious in the narrow corridors of the sewers, and it takes gas a really long time to clear indoors and stuff like that. However, they do appear to be effectively blind, which makes avoiding them pretty simple and easy, so not really an issue there. And yeah, there was a rework to sewers. Now, next up today from Karmakaze, we've got a rework to police loot, specifically their firearms. Now, as is often the case, I find myself lacking the enthusiasm for the dozenth rework to police zombies, and that's not your fault, Karmakaze, but every time I see a rework, my eyes glaze over. People keep changing the loot, and sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't, including this one, which I guess we're going to talk about here in a second. Now, in order to generalize this very broadly, let's just say police officer firearm drops were reworked in an effort to bring them more in line with real-life carries. So unsurprisingly, the most common handgun you're going to find now will be the Glock, or multiple Glocks, I guess technically, with assorted less common calibers and weapons being made more rare. The AR-15 is the most common rifle you'll find, makes a lot of sense. Shotguns might be a little less common, but they are still around as well. Snipers and submachine guns will now also appear in armories, where I don't think they did previously, and these are also pointed more specifically to SWAT officers and not your standard cop. Now, I do like that you didn't just update cop zombies like a lot of people would have, and you did instead separate them kind of from police and SWAT being separate entities. I approve of that. Now, the main thing of note here, I think, is the substantial reduction to the FN57 and its ammunition. This was one of the most talked about guns in this game. I saw its name literally daily in the discords, presumably because it was so common. However, after this, you will be very unlikely to find those guns, just given the major like I said, Glocks are going to be the most common thing by far. And then finally, my other thought here is that in the PR it says all dropped guns should have a chance of spawning damaged and dirty. Unfortunately, last I checked, having a damaged gun severely penalized that weapon's function to the point where they weren't even really usable, and the majority of, quote, damage that a gun would receive would probably render it completely unusable. In addition to my opinion being that a handgun in a holster probably would be nearly impossible to damage from a zombie shuffling around or bumping into things, I just feel that guns spawning damaged should be pretty rare, and it worries me anytime I see someone mentioning something like that in a PR. Now, it also mentions them being, quote, dirty and spawning dirty, which I had to ask in the dev Discord what that actually meant. Apparently it reflects a gun's fouling, which I also have an issue with. Now, the consensus on a gun's fouling, it's been posted repeatedly in Discord, the idea being that it takes thousands of rounds on a modern firearm to actually accumulate any significant amount of fouling, and that was reinforced by Rennick when I was asking questions in the developer Discord. The values added to these guns in this PR are significantly higher than any other example I found in the game, and while I think it makes sense for a police officer to have fired more rounds, especially in a zombie apocalypse, I really don't think that they should have 15 times the maximum dirty fouling that we see on other guns, like on a soldier zombie. It makes no sense. There's even an old PR from another simulacrum that pointed out that fouling should be almost non-existent on the majority of guns, and given the way our min and max ranges work, it's really not optimal for us to assign fouling in that way. So having a range here on these weapons of 1500 to 7050 again is like 15 times higher than what it was recommended they should actually be. And this is going to appear on basically every police long gun. In fact, I think pretty much every gun in this PR is going to be heavily affected by this fouling. Now anyway, I don't have to belabor it. I've probably talked about it too much already, but I'm losing the core of what we were talking talking about. Basically, police, zombie, and armory loot have been reworked, and I pretty strongly disapprove of the damage and fouling that have been assigned to the zombie weapon drops. I do really think that fouling is an issue, and so much so that when I brought it up, Rennick was like, yeah, we can probably just yeet all of those numbers because they don't make sense. Thanks again to Rennick for having that chat with me, and Mail Clips for a comment or 3 in that discussion. Moving on, next up today from Rathner, we've got some tweaks to the zombie wrestler. Now apparently they used to have the bio-op takedown, which mostly only older players will know. It's a very old thing that I thought was removed like 4 years ago. It was basically a special grab slam type attack that really doesn't belong on zombies anymore. Anyway, this was removed from the wrestler, and instead they were given a special new grab attack. Now they could grab you previously, and that still exists, like the normal grab and drag, and ranged pull attacks are all still assigned to this creature. However, they've received a new grab attack in addition to all of that, which is basically described as holding you in place with their other hand. So I think the implication here is that the wrestler is actually so strong that it can use either hand is like strong enough to immobilize you. Now this will stack up with their standard grabs as well, so these are very grabby lads. So yeah, I think having a second grab attack will make these pretty annoying creatures to deal with on top of their ranged pull and their ability to drag you, things like that. Definitely they should be approached individually. This seems like a nightmare if you're trying to fight 3 enemies at once or whatever. Yeah, other than that, we'll have to see if the cooldowns are appropriate, stuff like that, how it stacks up with the other grab attacks, things like that. I really approve of getting rid of the bio-op takedown. I don't even think that should be in the game, or at least it should be assigned to creatures that it makes sense to be assigned to. Obviously zombies are not going to be, like, it's basically a martial arts move of them like using your own weight to slam you to the ground. It's not something zombies should be doing. Next up today from Carl Arc TG, we've got 7 new zombie evolutions. And I'm not really sure that I want to evaluate and critique 7 monsters and make this like a super long segment. Now there will be a link to the PR in the description if you would like to read up on them, and of course you can check the HHG for specifics. So let's just pick a couple here to talk about. The 2 I've seen posted around and discussed were the Ocular Zombie and the Strider. So let's start with the Ocular Zombie. It's a creature that has a head full of eyes, the better to see you with, blah blah, like you know the story. Now the idea here was to create a zombie that could see you basically regardless of distance. Now this makes them an immediate threat the instant you get into range with them, or maybe even beyond your vision range. Now, unfortunately, they were also made to see through walls, which was apparently an accident, so that was fixed in a subsequent PR. They can no longer see you through buildings. I did see people commenting about this. And while I like this zombie in theory, they were given a 7 in melee and a 7 in dodge. Now I understand the concept. They have a lot of eyes, so they can be very accurate with their attacks, and they can see incoming attacks to dodge them. But I seriously dislike giving a dodge of 7 to a zombie. They are not actively trying to dodge our attacks, and a 7 in dodge is probably double the value that it should be here, in my opinion. For example, most ferals who would actively try to dodge our attacks have a dodge skill of around 3. Zombie hunters have a dodge of 3, zombie children are a dodge of 2, and the incredibly agile spy deer are a dodge of 4. I strongly dislike this. 7 here is a bad number in my opinion. Now the other part that I don't think makes sense is that these creatures path around danger. Our zombies in this game are not intelligent. We have enemies like Migo that actively path around dangerous tiles because they are intelligent. But zombies should not do this, in my opinion, ever do this, because we specifically have our zombies blunder into whatever's between them and their enemy. I don't think we should be assigning intelligent pathing to zombies, full stop, ever, because it sets a bad precedent. And again, I get it, they can see very well, but I think, oh, the zombie has lots of eyes should not equate to them being Neo dodging like crazy and suddenly being more intelligent than our other zombies by avoiding dangerous terrain. Now in terms of their incredible vision radius, I don't actually mind this. I think it would make things more interesting in general. I don't love it, but it's like if something comes beelining at you from down the street because it can see as far as you can, I don't really have an issue with that as long as they're not crazy overpowered. And then let's talk about the zombie strider. I saw people talking about these quite a lot on Discord. Now the PR added 3 creatures, the grasping zombie, the tentacled zombie, and the zombie strider that they refer to as, quote, their tentacle line of evolutions. Now the strider is described as being the Hulk version of the line with 180 HP but only a 60 speed. Now their main frustration seems to be that they are very grabby lads with their ranged pull attacks, push attacks, and grabs similar to what we discussed with the zombie wrestler earlier in the episode. And they also have a 3-tile ranged tentacle attack and a 3-tile ranged stretch attack. They also have a 1-tile leap attack, so every so often they'll actually get an extra tile of movement when they can fire off that leap. Now the leap has a cooldown of 3, which means it's pretty much going to be happening constantly, so we'll see how that goes. I don't love that that's a 3 cooldown. Now they do apparently have 0 armor, which I thought was a mistake in how the HHG displays those values, but looking at the entry, it does seem to in fact have 0 of most armors. I find that pretty odd, and as such they're a pretty good candidate for the old just shoot them while they're as far away as possible. Hey, so when I recorded this initially, I apparently never mentioned that they only have a vision radius of 8 tiles, and this makes this creature a lot less dangerous. I thought I mentioned this when I talked about just shooting them from a distance. The fact that they only have an 8 vision radius is like, it makes them significantly less dangerous, and the real threat here is just that it ties you up. That leap attack as well, it's not really as problematic as I sort of implied in this video. You definitely can just walk away from them in a lot of situations and get away. The real danger is that, like, if you get too close and then they get that leap attack on the same turn that they would get within 3 tiles of you, then they can pull you in, tie you up, grab you, etc. And they actually have multiple grabs, so you have to break multiple grabs, and if you're around other enemies, these are going to cause you a lot of trouble. These things are not going to kill you outright. They have very low damage. They're clearly designed to just tie you up while other creatures come and make trouble for you. So at the end here, I really don't have a problem with these creatures. I think they're actually pretty well balanced for something. Like, usually you don't see kind of well thought out creatures like this, so I actually kind of like this one. And again, this is the Hulk version of the tentacle line, so yeah. I don't know why I didn't mention all of this in the initial recording, so we're just gonna cut back to the regular video here. But anyway, yeah, there were a large number of enemies added in this PR, and hopefully after seeing how long it took me to talk about just 2 of them, you're gonna, understand why I'm not covering 7 of them in this video. So moving on, next up today from Rennick, we've got some tweaks for the Blob Lieutenant. So first of all, this PR adds a warning before the shadow appears. Now it says that there should be at least 1 warning that pops up prior to the creature appearing. These are pretty ominous messages. They're pretty straightforward, like, oh, you feel like something is wrong, you feel like something is stalking you, stuff like that. The second thing it did is removed various resistances from the shadow, although none of this will mean very much to your average player. For example, it removed the creature's shock resistance, which applies to basically no player weapons that I can think of, so it doesn't actually make much of a difference. It references mods attached to these nerfs, so I guess maybe an Aftershock or Magicalism or something like that, maybe it makes a difference. The PR even says something along the lines of, like, quote, it's better if it's not too hard to kill in vanilla, which I think is kind of hilarious because in my opinion this is still a completely busted, overpowered creature that's like a super binary encounter. Either you know how to kill it because you're an experienced player, or you get instantly murdered because you don't know how to handle it. And then finally here in this PR, they made it so that if you flee far enough, the shadow will actually leave, which unfortunately requires you to move several map tiles away from it. And with a speed of 200 and with you being constantly hounded by very fast amalgamations, it's amusing to me that you think fleeing is viable, especially when the main complaint from most players is that the shadow appears while they're out in the middle of nowhere in a field with no cover, in an open field. If you encounter this in an open field with no terrain, with limited stamina, pursued by this thing, it's a very binary encounter, like I said earlier. You either know how to handle it and you kill it, or you don't and you get murdered. It's pretty much that simple. simple. So looking at this PR, to me, all of these are token nerfs that don't actually affect the broken aspects of this creature. We continue to see issues from players who feel that their run ended abruptly whenever this thing appears. For an ill-prepared player or a new player, this creature represents an instant game over. Even for an experienced player, these summons are still too rapid and stack up very quickly. The regen and armor on the Shadow is still very, very high. It has a speed of 200, it has a 10 in dodge. Experienced players say, oh, just run at it screaming with a heavy-duty flashlight, but that's the meta level knowledge that is not really given to the player in any way. Most players don't even know this exists, let alone how to handle it, until they show up in Discord and they're like, yeah, I had a good run and then I got deleted by this monster. Now, as I said before, I understand the concept. This is the omega big bad thing that we've got in the game at the moment. But it's also the least balanced encounter in the game, and this is going to continue frustrating players because instead of fixing the core design flaws, you're dancing around it by adding a token message. You're removing resistances that basically don't matter and adding the ability to flee that, if you actually thought about it, you would realize it's basically impossible to flee due to those core design issues. So I still really like the idea of the Blob Lieutenant, but I currently just can't get on board with this implementation, and it makes me sad to watch new players lose runs over and over and not even understand what they could have done differently. I don't think this is a very fun element of the game at the moment. I don't even know, and I feel bad because I don't even know what I would do to fix a lot of these issues. I just because if you're new or you've never seen this before, if I bump into a Hulk for the first time, it's not guaranteed to end my run, right? You can kind of figure things out, you can escape, you can run around the terrain, whatever. But for a player who's never seen the Shadow before, half the time they wouldn't even know it exists because it's in the distance, in the darkness. They would just be overwhelmed and murdered and they don't even understand what killed them. And that makes me very sad, and I feel like we should prioritize a little bit, somehow relaying information to the player. I don't know, I don't want to rant about it. I just, I'm worried about this moving forward in the stable, and it really does. It makes me sad every time I see a new player hey, I finally survived 2 weeks and then I got murdered in the darkness by something I couldn't even see. And look, I know it's permadeath and the game is hard, but I don't know. It just bothers me. It bothers me. I'm sure I'm going to continue talking about it in the future as well, and I'm sure they're going to keep working on it. I just, I don't love the way it is right now. And I think actually we're going to call the episode there. Now, I did have 2 other things slated here on the list to talk about, which I'll try to link in the description down below. Basically, I wanted to mention a bronze expansion and rework that's been taking place, but I did not actually research this. And I also wanted to mention that Lovum made a big issue list for things that he wants to change in the Mapgen type stuff, and there's been some people working on a lot of those things, I guess in preparation for the next stable, but it might just be things that they came back and now they want to work on some stuff. But neither of these are really specific things to talk about. The bronze rework is quite large. It's had several PRs that I would have to go back and research, and I just don't think many people use bronze in general. And for the Mapgen rework, it's kind of one of those things that's very behind the scenes that most players aren't going to notice a lot of these changes. Some of them are bigger things, but there are also things that are oh, we fixed the roof of this one building. And while I think those things are very important for the actual quality of the game, I don't think most of you care very much. So I did just sort of want to mention them offhandedly here at the end of the episode. With that though, I can feel my mental health slowly slipping away again, so hopefully, this one gets out at a reasonable time. Probably not, right? It's probably going to go up a Monday or something like that. Everyone, thank you for bearing with me for many years as I go through more and more brain chemistry and severe mental health issues as I gradually deteriorate as I get older. Everybody hanging in there and getting value out of these videos. Thanks for being here. Of course, I'll be back in a few weeks, hopefully with another episode, and I'll see you next time.